Welcome back to the Inside Japan podcast. I'm Charlie, and today I'm talking with Garr Reynolds, 5-time TEDx speaker, used to work at Apple, and he wrote the best-selling book Presentation Zen, and now he's teaching at Kansai Gaidai. He's teaching communication design. Garr, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hello, good to see you again.
Yeah, so I want to jump straight into it. Let's talk about your book, Presentation Zen. So Presentation Zen is all about how to communicate in an effective and sort of, it seems like there's a minimalist and spiritual, almost spiritual tone to that, like the way you talk about it. And especially like after watching your TED talk about presentation and communication, it's really interesting, like how you take a lot of your presentation philosophy is about taking away distractions. So can you tell us a little bit about your book Presentation Zen, like why you wrote it?
Coincidentally, I have it right here, but that's
interesting.
That wasn't planned. I had it for something else yesterday. I wonder if I could like put things. So that's actually what the book looks like. And I had this, this is what this is. And when I, was designing the book or creating the book, it's in 3rd edition now. So this is many years ago. I was focused on, conference presentation, TED style presentations, but, doctors and all sorts of people go to conferences, researchers, boardrooms, all of that. So on stage or in a boardroom, live presentations, student presentations, whatever. I wasn't really thinking about online until about a year ago, actually. But many of the things did apply. And in fact, in the 2nd edition of the book, I have a call out section from the master online presenter who's in Australia, and he wrote a special section on that because he had contacted me saying that the principles in the book can, the principles can be applied directly to online meetings and making videos and so on. So this is coming from the guru in Australia. So the principles, each case is different. So that's why I talk a lot about principles, storytelling principles and graphic design principles. How you implement them will be different for each case. But what we don't want to do is to do something like, let's see if I have something. Well, I can kind of show you what was happening. So when I, in February of 2020, right, we had to go all online. So I had students make videos, but make a video recording of their presentations, which they did usually in PowerPoint. And then you get something like this, right? So this is me looking at the computer screen. Even if it's a good slide like this, still it's, the person speaking is this tiny little thing. Right. And they're looking at their notes. They're usually looking at themselves as they're talking. Not very engaging, and they seem very uncomfortable with it. So we learned scratch that. So we learned how to make better videos. So we ended up doing something like this.
Right. So just quickly for the people who are listening on Apple Podcasts or something like that, we're looking at some presentation slides. If you want to check out the video version of the podcast on YouTube, you can do that. And we're looking at some presentation slides. And you've seen what Zoom looks like when you're doing when you're sharing your screen. You can see kind of like the slides or something, and then the person comes up in a tiny little box in the corner, and usually they're looking at their screen or they're looking at their notes, not looking at the camera. And so it's really, you don't really engage with the person themselves, right? Like you're looking at the screen, and it becomes kind of boring. It becomes dull almost immediately without having a little bit something different. So this second slide that you've shown me is the student is kind of full frame. You can see their shoulders and their head and everything in half of the screen, and then their slides are kind of like a little bit off to the side, which is, I think that's a really interesting way of doing presentations. I think I kind of stole some of those ideas from you when I saw like you were posting about it on your Facebook about how to do better online presentations.
Yeah.
And I was teaching online on and off during the last year when I was teaching at the international school, and it was really, really useful for me.
Well, I was inspired in high school to do it this way. And this is before PowerPoint was invented, but I'd made presentations with 35 millimeter slides. And then I always thought that it should be like the network news. I mean, the BBC, we know how to do this. The presenter needs to be, front and center, and the visuals complement, and you can go in and out from visuals, and, the screen can go black. You can do all sorts of things, but we shouldn't just be this little voice, where we never see the person. I could show the slide. I'm showing the slide full screen. So you could do something like this. Anyway, so sorry about the people who are driving in their car who couldn't see it. But yeah, you're very familiar with it because we see it on the news all the time. You watch 22-minute news program, you see the presenter. I think in England or in UK, they call it more of a TV presenter. It's not a term they use as much in the States, but and you see that person. Sometimes it's a close-up, sometimes it's full body. You see a lot of text around. There can be text overlays. There's photos, there's charts and graphs, there's interview. in 22 minutes, there's a lot of visual stuff going on there, but it's not just a death by PowerPoint kind of thing. So that's what we did. And so in those days, this is before, if I look at something, like this. So in those days, even just using something like iMovie. So you record yourself, and then you can record the slides at the same time. You can make a movie of the slides, PowerPoint or Keynote, in Windows or Mac, whatever you're doing. And then it's just very easy to sync that up in something like iMovie, right? And students did that so much better. It's a little bit, there's a few more steps involved, but it's quite easy to do. And they actually really love doing it. My students' evaluations have never been higher in the 20 years I've been at Kansai Gaidai, and that's true for the entire university. It's insane. We never thought that would be like this. Students are actually happier. They're definitely making better presentations. They can have their notes, but I don't know that they're ever even looking at their notes because the notes are right there next to the camera, right? So there's a lot of advantages, and the content that they're creating is really awesome.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how not only all of these presentation tips and advice, like how did that factor in when you were preparing for a TED Talk? Because I've always had, and I'm sure a lot of people who are listening have some kind of dream to do a TED Talk someday, and you've done several of them. How do you go about prepping for that? And like, what are some things that you need to keep in mind when you're thinking of talking to this sort of like broad audience, not only in the theater or auditorium where you're doing it, but also online?
Well, doing a TEDx talk or a TED Talk, I have many friends who have done the actual TED on the stage, and others who have done TEDx talks. And it's actually much harder than doing something like an hour lecture or a 3-hour seminar, because if it's a 3-hour seminar, you can have way too much stuff and you can kind of see what happens and you can pull from that. But when you only have 8 minutes or 10 minutes and you know a lot of stuff, depending on what the topic is for a lot of people, well, that's really challenging. You cannot go over time. And I only went to the real, the TED, the actual TED in those days, Long Beach. And so what you don't see is there were presenters who went over time, and they were the guy, Chris Anderson, came out. You can't go over time. They're really serious about that.
He's just like, cut, get off the stage.
Yeah. And this was a kind of a famous person, and she was shocked. And like, you can't be shocked by that, because this is you got to be prepared. You can be a little short, but you just can't go over. And I think that's a good principle. So I didn't have this. Didn't know I was going to show this, but I think thinking of any kind of presentation or a TED Talk like an iceberg, culture is like an iceberg. Your presentation, like a conference talk, is 20 minutes or whatever. That's a short time. But what the audience doesn't see, of course, is underneath. And that's all the research that you did. That could be years of research that you've got to go through. Then the actual preparing for the presentation involves brainstorming and thinking about, well, what's important for this audience and what's not? What can I cut out? Then how can I get organized and, cutting out what I don't need, and then designing and thinking about the kind of visuals that will really amplify the message. And it's not the same for each person, but generally speaking, some kind of visual is better than no visual in almost every case. But on the other hand, really crappy visuals, it would be better to have no visuals than a horrible visual, with just a lot of text and just, awful things that confuse. And so TED is, one of the first organizations that kind of became famous. This is when they went on the internet. I forget, 2005, I think.
Yeah,
I think it was 2005, because I was right there, putting their stuff up on my website. And, they knew that the visuals are very important. So you can't have just going through, laser pointer and going through text on a slide, which is common in universities and high schools, I guess, but it doesn't fly when you've only have 8 minutes to do it.
Right. And that cutting stuff out is a really important thing. And I think you posted about this on Facebook a few days ago. You posted a Kurosawa quote from Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese film director. And I think it was, you don't need what you don't need.
Yeah, people are going to think this was planned, but it really wasn't planned. But I just happened to have it, right here. There it is. So you don't need what you don't need. Honest to God, this was not planned, but this just goes to show you that this, you can show visuals even in a live presentation.
All right, and
Yeah,
it really resonates with me as well because I think I saw that the other day when I was editing up a video. And sometimes you're working on something and you think how much time you put into something. Like it took me, I had to set up this shot and I took the video and it took me like an hour and I spent this much money like buying all of the stuff for it, and then that's all gone to waste. And you think I've got to find a way to fit this shot into the final
yeah,
video because it was so expensive and time consuming, and I really wanted to put this shot in. But if it doesn't actually work for your audience and it doesn't actually do what you need it to do, then you should cut it, even though you put a lot of work into it.
Yeah, that's why I like, the first Star Wars films, 4, 5, and 6, because I thought they were very economic. I thought there was nothing superfluous or extraneous. If you look back at those films, they seem not a lot of CG like we do today. And then films 1, 2, and 3, like there's a lot of stuff that didn't seem to really project the story forward. Now, who am I to lecture George Lucas? But millions of people have complained about this very same
right. Well,
thing.
there was a really good breakdown of there's a fight in the third one, the Revenge of the Sith, I think it was, so that between Anakin and Obi-Wan, and then someone was saying like this fight was 28 minutes of screen time. And then you look at the original, the first movie, where they're both old, and the fight is, in terms of the actual fighting itself, it's not fantastic CG. It's just two old men fighting with sticks, basically. But the first one, the original one, when they're old, is so much more interesting. There's so much more emotional content in that fight than in the one that took 30 minutes and had tons of beautiful CG. Because really, like you're taking so much time to tell a short story, and even not as powerful a story.
I don't want to get off topic, but it's funny how those first 1, 2, and 3 seem dated. I mean, the CG, everything looks really dated, but the ones from the 70s and 80s, they don't look dated. It's the story. Star Trek. I mean, if I love the Star Trek TV show, which is so ridiculously minimal, and of course it's a little bit camp. It's supposed to be a little camp, but I just think it's great, and you can focus more on the characters in the TV show, and the characters and the plot and the message, the story.
For sure. Okay, I want to come back to what you were saying about doing Zoom classes, though, because I know a lot of teachers who are still, even now, doing online classes, especially if they're teaching at universities. What were some of the things that you did that helped the class to be interesting? Because that was one of the things that I really struggled with as soon as we went online, because I'm quite technically proficient. I'm quite good with computers and technology. I know a lot of other teachers at my school who really, really weren't. But even I found it really hard to keep the class engaging and exciting like it would have been in person when you're online, because you don't have any control methods over the students. Like a lot of teachers would be able to see which students weren't paying attention or which students were sort of engaged with a certain point, and you can react to that. But when you're teaching online, it's really hard. There's too much information coming at you. So what would you advise?
So I mean, first of all, you have to have the right mindset and attitude. You have to, I want to do this. You can't be complaining like I was to myself a year ago, like, oh, I'm so good. I got to be spontaneous. I'm a live person. I'm about being live, man. So this online thing, which they said would last 2 weeks, and then the virus will be over. We can go back. So you can't resist it. And actually now I've embraced it. And as I said, my reviews or what they call them, surveys, are the highest they've ever been. In fact, I won an award for that, but that isn't, I don't want to, anyway. So I'm so humble. That's the greatest thing I love about myself. Anyway, you can cut that part out. But,
no, I want to keep it in.
But some of the surveys, what I've heard from, because surveys are high overall, and some of the professors who had the boring, so-called boring lectures, they're doing much better now. And I think it's because there's several reasons. One, you can see the names of all your students. This is awesome, because it's hard to remember, even a class of 20. I can't, get the names always without name cards on. I know their names. I call their names. I start every class by going, because I don't have big classes, they're 10 or 20. And each student I go through and, Keiko, how you doing? How you doing today? And just that, I mean, think about classes you had when you were in college where the professor never even said your name, let alone every class. And of course, then during the class, I can ask people what they think, and I generally want them to participate. I don't want to force someone who's really shy, to talk if they don't want to, just like I do in a real class. But just by going through that and breaking the ice and making people feel comfortable, getting to know each other, then they're kind of talking to each other. I'm still there, of course, but I don't want to be, it's just Q&A with me or me doing the didactic approach, but they're actually talking to each other, to everyone. But how I do it, I don't use, for example, I'm using slides here using or you could use other kinds of software, a third-party software to go with Zoom. But I usually just use Zoom, and I have my keynote slides or PowerPoint, doesn't matter what. And then often, so I am just this little box, down there. But I use a lot where I'll, hit the B key, or I just have an empty space in my slide. So I use the drawing pen a lot because I'm explaining things, and I don't plan it, but I find that students are really engaged. Just like, who's that guy that the Khan Academy, right? Actually, you never see Khan's face, but he would just explain as he's going. You're drawing the pictures or diagrams. And my best professors, even in college, before internet, it was the ones that used a chalkboard in those days just to explain as they were talking, and then you're following along.
Right, because it's multi-medium, right? So if you're just listening to someone's voice, there will be certain students who really engage with that. They like to listen. And maybe those are the kind of people who also like to listen to a podcast or something. But then there are some students who are really visual, and then there are some students who are really like kinesthetic learners. They like to touch and write or play with something so that they can actually think. And if you're doing more than one of those things at a time, then you're helping multiple different kinds of students who have different learning styles to pick it up. Sure.
And I think the basic concept is the same with an hour or a 90-minute class, the 10-minute rule, which was John Medina's in his Brain Rules book. Basically, you have to change every 9 or 10 minutes. You just change what you're doing. So now it's time for a 3-minute video, right? Or it could be an 8-minute TED Talk. There's a discussion. I'm going to talk and explain these things, or whatever. You got to do different things. But if you're thinking, I'm just going to do it like I do, like a lot of professors, I'm going to basically talk for 90 minutes. Yeah. And then say, any questions? No question, right? It happens in Japan a lot at the end. じゃあ、質問がないですね。じゃあ、以上で終わります. Okay, we're finished. Right?
Right.
So just variety. Yeah, I think that's the main thing. Just like a live presentation, just more so. So maybe not the 10-minute rule, but the 5-minute rule.
Yeah, and it can be difficult sometimes to get students to and I think if that's your goal, I think that's maybe you need to think about changing your goals. But a lot of teachers want to get students to talk, and they want to get students to engage. And I think that's a really difficult thing to do online. I've liberally used breakout groups so that I could move my students into a group of 3 or 4 people, and then they could talk. And then I would say, okay, when we come back, like May is going to talk about this one, like what happened in your group, and then Koki is going to talk about what happened in his group. And then when they come back, they already know and they're prepared, and they're like, okay, I have to say something when I come back, and so let's talk about it in the group and make sure that I'm prepared. And then I change that person every time. And if they did terribly, then it's like, okay, we'll move on. I'm not going to like put a kid on the spotlight and make them feel stupid by telling them like, okay, everyone's come back. Okay, I'm going to pick somebody to like speak up in front of their whole class on Zoom. So I think that's a pretty, that'll be stressful for anybody, really, even for me, if someone picked me out of a crowd.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And so for anyone who wants to come to Japan to be a instructor or a teacher, that's good advice when you're working with Japanese students. It'll seem like they're very shy and hesitate to speak, but it isn't that. There are techniques you can do, such as you're doing a breakout room. You can do in a live classroom too. So there's 5 of you, and then among those 5 or 4, not everyone needs to speak. So you choose, well, who's the person that's one person can write it down, one person can speak. So you don't have to put people on the spot, and they'll come up with ideas. But if you just said, who has an idea about X or a comment about X, it's going to be silent.
Right. And you have to prep a little bit. You have to prepare for that. So that's doing something like that with the group. I took me a long time to learn this. I was teaching in Japan. I was like, why are these kids so quiet? Like, I don't get it. I would, when I was their age, I'd be doing all this. And it's like, well, we're from different cultures. And in Japan, because of the kind of group contribution culture, actually, they do want to contribute, but they want to contribute in a specific role. They want to understand, where am I contributing? What's the thing that I'm in charge of? What's the thing that I'm responsible for? And I'll do it to the best of my ability once I know that. But if you just pick me out of a crowd and go, okay, contribute, it's like, okay, I don't know, because I don't know. I didn't have any time to prepare. So putting a little bit of like a buffer, a few minutes to go, like, okay, I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes in your breakout group, and you're going to talk about this. And then when you come back, I want to hear this, I want to hear this, and I want to hear this.
Mhm.
Okay. And then when they go, then they're like, okay, I know what I need to do. And then they can prepare for it. And then and then it surprises me every time how brilliantly my students can speak in English
Yeah.
publicly.
Yes.
When, just 5 minutes before, if I was saying, hey, talk, they get all quiet. And I'm like, oh my God, they can't speak English at all.
Yeah, there was a story about I don't know if it's true, but I'm 95% sure it's true. It's when I was working at Apple that Steve had gone. I think it was on the Apple campus, and we call it Asian Pac directors, managers from all over Asia came to Cupertino, and Steve had 30 minutes with them, so he talked for 5 minutes, and then he said, "Any questions?"
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the conversation, and I just want to take a quick moment to mention that this podcast is only possible because of the support of JobsinJapan.com. So next time you're looking for a job, check out JobsinJapan.com. There are tons of jobs on there, not only in English teaching, but also software engineering, hospitality, marketing and consulting, among many others. Most of the jobs on the board do not require any specific level of Japanese, and you can get started in minutes. So next time you're looking for a job, check out JobsinJapan.com, and let's get back to the conversation.
There were no questions, and apparently he got very angry and used the F word, which that sounds like him. And he was like, "What's wrong with you? You come all the way here and you don't." And of course, he's a very smart guy, but we wouldn't be surprised by that. Okay, many people coming from. I mean, it's a generalization to say Asia, but this is the great tate shakai, right? Vertical society. This is the great Steve Jobs, and it's at least in Japan, people are really going to hesitate to ask questions to somebody like that, right? Because a question can also be thought of as a complaint, or it's just we hesitate. I mean, I've been in Japan long enough to where I hesitate. I don't know how to act, sometimes if I went to the States, I don't like really speaking up in class. Yeah. I mean, I have ideas. I just kind of, I don't know, something happens to you. That's culture kind of gets into you that way, and you hesitate and you're more reserved, but it doesn't mean that you don't have the ideas or the passion. So I think your idea of splitting people up, it works well.
So I'm curious about working with Steve Jobs as well. Like what, because you worked, I believe you did group relations, like worldwide group relations in Apple.
Yeah. As a manager of worldwide user group relations, these are like brand communities, really the heart and soul, especially of the early Apple before iPhone days. And they in a way saved the company, because in 1997 they were about 1/4 away from bankruptcy. I think it was 96 maybe.
Wow.
And Jobs came back in 97. I mean, it was that bad. I mean, all the articles, I could show you headlines that said, the fall of an icon, and Apple was definitely going to disappear. And it goes from that to it's one time the biggest or the most valued company in the world. And I think it's often the number one brand in terms of brand equity. So that was quite a turnaround. But I didn't work with him. My boss worked directly with him. But those user groups were really, really important. And in fact, Apple started in a way from user groups, from the Homebrew Computer Society, which I think they used to meet on the Stanford campus. So that's kind of in the DNA of Apple in the early days, was that kind of hobbyist, really, smart men and women who would get together for the passion of the technology to build their own computers and share things. That, Steve Wozniak was really, because without Steve Wozniak, there's no Apple, but without Steve Jobs, there was no Apple as well. But two very different people.
So what were some of the things that you learned from, not necessarily working directly with, but working for Steve Jobs? What things did you learn while working at Apple?
There's been a lot written about him, and he's not. And sometimes people think, well, he's really a hero. And first of all, my mother is a hero to me, but I don't have any heroes. And he's not. I don't know about his personal life, but he sometimes could be mean to people, and I don't believe in doing that. Even I have worked with CEOs of very big, Fortune, 200 companies or so, who are really nice people. And so I always thought you can't be a nice person. It doesn't mean of course you have to be firm and all that, but you can be nice to everyone and try to build people up that way. So I don't know, but one thing I really liked, what attracted me to Apple in the beginning was his presentations. I knew about, the 1984 stuff, the introduction of the first Macintosh, which was 1984. And then when he came back I used to listen to his keynote addresses in the 97, 98. They were little QuickTime videos. They must have been, I don't know how many pixels. 200 pixels or probably less than that. It was crazy and crappy sound. And I would watch that live, 1 frame per second. And I thought that's a really cool way to present. And that's how I presented in high school, because that was the TV news way of presenting, where it's the person talking in a conversational, compassionate, or not compassionate, a passionate way, not over the top, but a passionate way. And then the visuals are there to amplify the message in a very almost cinematic way. So that's what attracted me to that, just his way of speaking. He is very charismatic in public, and he almost never lost it in public. Very smart, very charismatic. I don't know, genius. I don't know what that means. It's a kind of like I said, no Steve Jobs, there's no Apple originally. But as we're seeing, Apple's done very well, is still doing very well. But that originally was those two guys, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. Yeah. So anyway, you asked me, what have I learned? So what are the lessons for me? It really is about communication on stage and the branding. And he understood what a brand was. He paid attention to all those early, venture capitalists and smart guys who knew how to run companies when he was like 20 years old. He knew what a brand was and what a brand promise was. And so when he came back to Apple in 97, there were too many products, confusing lineups. And so he came back and he just cut. And a lot of people would be angry. He would cut software that would make people angry or companies angry, and hardware. But he had to do that. So he really was all about simplicity. I mean, he lived it. He lived just down the street from me. He didn't have a fancy house. He was a billionaire with a very modest, actually. I mean, it's Palo Alto, so nothing is really modest, but pretty expensive. But, he didn't have bling. He really did just wear crappy shorts and flip-flops and in Palo Alto. So, I also appreciate that. I mean, he did have a nice Mercedes, and, he was a billionaire. But for him, obviously, I respect those guys that become billionaires or millionaires and they keep working. Because or anyone who just keeps working if they don't need the money, because it obviously wasn't about the money. It's about something else. So
it's about the passion for the craft, and I think that's the thing that people should be looking for, instead of looking for who made a lot of money. And I think that's one of the things that I think I noticed, to further to our conversation about YouTube, is that a lot of people think I'd love to make money as a YouTuber. That would being able to create content and be paid to just kind of goof around with my friends or something. But what they don't realize is that the reason those people get to where they are is passion for something that they're doing. I wonder also, who are your other inspirations? Because you've talked about like Steve Jobs and like Kurosawa as well, and some of the other very powerful presenters, but who are some of the people who inspire you with their communication style, like whether it's film directors or storytellers of other kinds?
You put me, I should have, sometimes I need time to think about things, so I haven't thought about that. I mean, I like, Scorsese and, all these guys. I love George Lucas, especially when he was younger, but even now, I mean, if he's a very interesting guy to listen to. I like listening to those guys that went to the traditional film school route. I don't know, there was a song. I used to love this George Benson version of the song, Learning to Love Yourself, the greatest love of all, right? And I don't have any heroes. Of course I loved, football heroes and all that when I was a kid, but as I got older, I don't have heroes, but except, like my mother, someone who I really admire and respected and loved, obviously. But yeah, I did look, like I said, so, and musicians, people, I mean, there are stories. Guys, it gets a little bit off topic. I loved Maurice White with Earth, Wind and Fire. This might be dating. You might not know, you're too young, but
no, I do know Earth, Wind and Fire, of course.
But you might think it was a pop group, but it's just really great. They were another example. Jazz musicians that were working for years, highly trained, brilliant guys. And again, they didn't become an overnight success. There were years you didn't know about them until their breakout, and then they became this phenomenon. And so I learned a lot from, studying guys like that. I'm inspired by that. And they also understood the visual, by the way. This was early in the 70s. So their stage concerts were these magnificent things with pyramids, and they understood the music was great, but it had to be a visual show as well. So yeah, I try to take inspiration. This has been one of the things I often talk about in the book, is that you don't get presentation advice from books on slideware on PowerPoint or Keynote. And before I wrote the book, everything was about how to use PowerPoint. Huge 400-page books on how to use PowerPoint. Like if only my employees knew how to use PowerPoint, then everything would be solved. And that's exactly back-asswards. So if my employees knew how to, a million other things, how to be organized, how to cut the superfluous, how to have an honest dialogue, and on and on. So I think filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, musicians, and so on, novel writers, there's a lot of lessons there that actually can help us. So which is why I think film school is still a great thing. And if you can afford it, I mean, if you have a way to get to film school, even though you'll be studying traditional things, a lot of things about the human condition haven't changed for thousands of years. So it's still good to understand, the why of this, whether from storytelling or editing and so on. There's many things to learn from the old ways. I'm rambling again. Well, that's what you get for a live presentation.
No, it's really interesting. And it's kind of an interesting thing that you ended up in Japan after, I think a lot of people who imagine if you had a job at Apple, I mean, maybe people are thinking about this in the world today. If you worked at Apple, people might think you're crazy for ever having left Apple. Like that's now it's like one of the biggest companies in the world. And so what kind of made you want to come to Japan and what was the motivation behind that?
For me, I'd already been in Japan, and I left a good job at Sumitomo. I never would have left Japan. I was very happy in Japan, and I had a big company. Sumitomo is one of the so-called zaibatsu, so it's a good job. I was president of the Macintosh user group in Kansai, so I had a good social network, all this stuff. But when I had a chance, when they said yes, we'd like you to come work there, I sold the farm, as they say, and uprooted. But after about a year, I became, I didn't realize, I'm pretty unhappy. I wouldn't say depressed, but it's a kind of depression. It felt very hollow. And I don't want to complain about people. I had kind of like friends, people I work with, but very hard for a guy who's in his late 30s to make friends. And it's so different than in Japan. I just didn't have the social network. I felt sort of motivated or unchallenged because, in Japan, the language is always hard. There's a million different cultural differences. And I wasn't that happy in Silicon Valley. If I could have lived anywhere, if they said, you can work remotely, come to Cupertino once a month, but you can work in Oregon, for example, the Oregon coast. So if I could have done that, I would have stayed. I wouldn't have minded staying at all. But also I didn't have the freedom to make presentations like, I can now, or write books, because you can't do that. They're very strict about basically only Steve Jobs and a few other key people were allowed to talk to the public, even though I needed to talk to user groups. I had to keep a lot of stuff under the radar. So when I had a chance to do the university gig, I just jumped at it. Plus I miss Japan. I love Japan. The biggest thing, if people, what is the biggest thing about Japan? It is the food. It seems like a silly thing, but food is actually extremely important. And to some cultures more so, I think. China, Japan, Italy, maybe, a bunch of other countries. I think in the States, food is not as important. It's almost like food is looked at. Maybe England's like this too, or UK's like this. Food is like, I just got to eat because I'm hungry and I got to get fuel inside. It's like content creation. Whereas in a lot of other older cultures, I mean, the best food I've ever had is in China. It's amazing. And I just think it's that deep culture. Food is so emotional, actually. You don't realize how emotional. At least I never did. And I'm not a good cook. So, I found shopping very frustrating. There's a lot of frozen and canned stuff. Whereas in Japan, well, you know what it's like. Yeah. It's just, we have the most Michelin 5 stars, or for whatever, it's 3 stars, what's the top? 3?
I think it's 3. Yeah, 3.
The most 3-star restaurants in the world are in Tokyo, and there could be more, but a lot of the people will say like, hey, we don't want that. We don't want the attention.
Yeah. So, I think there's a reason for, and I heard about this from a friend, and it totally made sense, that a lot of the cultures that have the most interesting food culture is it's because they didn't have access to that many different ingredients. And so they had to find creative ways to use those. So Japan has a lot of fish. And so if you think of like some of the food here, like one of the things that I really don't like in Japanese food, I love most Japanese food, but I don't like katsuobushi, which is the flakes of the the skin. I mean, even just talking about it.
Does it look like it moves? Or is that the stuff that moves
yes,
around?
yeah. It's like the flakes of the skin of the
Yeah.
I forgot the name in English. It's like not
It looks like it's alive. I always thought it kind of freaks
right.
me out.
So it's kind of like a cured skin of a fish, and it's because you can't waste the food when you don't have that many options for food. And so you look at Italy, they have a lot of different kinds of food, but they don't have a huge variety. They have so they've found ways to go like, okay, well, we've got cows and milk, so let's find different cheeses that we can make or something. But America was completely characterized by abundance of everything, right? So that's why I think American food culture is abundance. It's huge portions of everything. And I found when I went to America that the food didn't taste particularly interesting, but there was just a lot of it. And whereas in Japan, where it's like, okay, well, we have fish, what can we do with fish? Okay, well, we can we can try cutting it in the perfect way that avoids all of the gristly fatty bits and puts just the perfect part of the steak and put that on some rice. Okay, we've got that, and that really is, I think, part of the reason why Japan has such an amazing food culture, because like you said, cutting away, actually, I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about how to do things well, is cut away things that aren't as important and focus, like a constraint, a good constraint. I think there's a book that I read on this, which is called The Beautiful Constraint. Yes. Having a constraint helps you to actually focus and achieve something amazing.
Yes. Well, actually, that's one of the key principles is restraint in the presentation method, restraint in the preparation stage, especially, and that's where you think about what's important and what's not. You can't include everything. Actually, your stories, that's really good. I'd never thought about it that way. That it inspires me to go. There's a few other similar stories. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor from Korea. And in those days, we were using Macs to write our thesis and all that. This is in the late 90s sometime. And she had lamented that, it was easier when I was a PhD student at Stanford, she said, because we just had typewriters. So in those days, you'd write it out on paper and then you type it up and you don't go back and futz with everything because it's done. But in today's world, or this was in the 90s with computers, we just go and we rewrite and we put this graph and we do all this stuff. And this was her 25 years ago saying, maybe it's the constraints were in a way a good thing that forced you to be simple. And I think it's that way as well with what's going on right now with film, video editing, video creation, all the software that's out there, right? You actually could make something really good in just iMovie, although it's frustrating not having the layers. But because if you look at really good films, there's almost no transition. It's usually just a cut. Not so many special effects, like in a good, not a Marvel movie, but just a good movie. And now I'm seeing everyone's selling a software, for $100, whatever. You have 10,000 transitions. And so to be a good storyteller, to be a good YouTuber, your video should be, right? Don't forget to like and subscribe. And I really hate that. I hate it. Hey, you don't know me. I've just met you. Don't forget to do me a special favor right off the book. Like and subscribe this video. It's like, no, go to hell. I hate that. I really hate that. So anyway, I got a little bit off topic there, but keeping it simple. It's not about special effects, and sometimes having that restraint or constraints. I just bought Filmora, which I highly recommend. I love Filmora, and I bought the Pro Pack or something that comes with like 18 million special effects, transitions and effects. And I find myself going, oh God, why am I using these? And I'm spending so much time looking at them. And I guess it's nice to have them. But if you look back at the 80s, if you just Google like 80s TV shows and news programs, they just discovered or had the ability to do kind of digital things, special effects in TV. And so you see it all the time, just so many things like, do we really need all this? So I think that's a way to
I think that's really true. You look back on that and you think, wow, this looks really dated. But then like you said, you look at something like Star Wars, the original Star Wars movies, they don't look dated because they used in a very kind of minimalistic way, and they use the camera mostly. Like a lot of the stuff is in camera, whereas more modern movies, they'll just be like, oh, just get the CG team to put that on. And I think this is a really good point. I think someone did a video about Jurassic Park, the original Jurassic Park, and then like the newer Jurassic Park movies. And it's like the original one, it's like there's one T-Rex and he's chasing a car and that's it. And it's in the dark and there's rain and there's and it looks amazing. Even today, it looks amazing. And then you look at the newer ones, and they've got like hundreds of dinosaurs, and it's all this stuff going on, and there's all the dinosaurs are running past, and they're rolling down the hill in a glass ball, and it's very spectacular, but you feel nothing, because it's all fake, and it's almost ridiculous in the way that it's presented. So that I like that idea, like a minimalist, simple, like focus on one thing, and do that the best you can, and do as much of it in a sort of practical, simple way, and cut the fat. Yeah, I think so. I just watched the Marvel movie last night. We watch a lot of Marvel movies because my son is now 9 years old, and so they're fun. It's fun. It's like a movie version of Disneyland or something. It's just fun, but the fight scenes are very long, and there's so much going on, and it's not the reason Star Wars worked in the early ones is because we felt, I was just afraid of Darth Vader because it was all the stuff building up. That's what made it so compelling. The techniques are not, as you say, it's two guys with sticks. And yet now with this Marvel, we just watched this Marvel, all this stuff. It's like, it's too much. And I find myself going, that would never happen. You've just defied the laws of physics with that. Yeah, I could talk with you about this forever, Garr, but I want to wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Where can people find you if they want to find out about your book or about your other work and the YouTube series that you're doing now with new presenters, people who have learned presenting arts? Oh
yeah, well I'm going to. Well, I guess if you want to contact me, the GarrReynolds.com. So that's my name together, GarrReynolds.com, or PresentationZen.com. Either of those places you can find me. Just use the Google, and I'm on Twitter at PresentationZen.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much.